The battle for the fate of the First Age. This is it, the conflict that will decide the rest of what's to come, the future of elves and men and dwarves in Beleriand, the entire war with the Dark Lord Morgoth. If our heroes win, it could be the beginning of the Dark Lord's ruin. If they don't win, then it's basically the end. But either way, this is the event that will determine everything. The fifth battle, the greatest yet, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. Maya, Govan and Melanine, and welcome to part 2 in this trilogy explaining and untangling the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, one of the biggest moments in the Silmarillion and the entire First Age. And the first person to talk about here, the guy who kicks the whole thing off, is Maedhros, firstborn son of Feanor, beloved cousin of High King Fingon, and absolute badass. This is the guy who Morgoth once chained to the precipice of Thangorodrim for 24 years. His hatred of the Dark Lord is pretty much unmatched. Since his homelands fell in the last battle of Sudden Flame, Maedhros has just remained steadfast atop his solitary hill of Himring, killing orcs for 17 years. But then, 10 years after the last battle, something happens that fundamentally shifts his perspective. A single mortal man called Beren and a single immortal elf called Luthien broke into Morgoth's fortress of Angband, and they stole a Silmaril from the crown atop his head, and then they escaped. And the Silmaril they stole is still out there. So, as story spread across Middle-earth of this incredible duo, Beren and Luthien, Maedhros is faced with a new reality. Despite Morgoth's victory in the last great battle, he is not unconquerable. Between the fourth battle and the fifth, Fingolfin inflicted such permanent wounds upon him that he will never again leave his stronghold. Beren humiliated him by stealing a Silmaril and surviving, and Luthien stood before his throne and put him to sleep. So what if, instead of 3 individuals, it was everyone? All enemies of Morgoth united, all 3 peoples upon the battlefield, fighting under one banner and taking Beleriand back from the Dark Lord. And so the Union of Maedhros was called. And although Union of Maedhros is what Tolkien calls this coming together of 3 people, I think it can be imagined as the event that will, in 3,500 years, inspire the formation of the last alliance. You know, the union of elves and dwarves and men who brought about the downfall of Sauron under the command of Gil-galad and Elendil. In a lot of ways, the Union of Maedhros really is the first alliance. Much like the War of the Last Alliance, but unlike every single battle so far, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad does not begin because Morgoth attacks the good guys and they're forced to fight back. This is begun by the Alliance. They are the ones making this happen. And so, let's talk about who it is exactly that makes up this Union of Maedhros, because there are a lot of important players, and it's a really cool rundown of many different badasses from completely different branches of First Age history. But the first thing to say is that it's not quite as astonishingly all-encompassing as it could have been, and that is directly because of 2 of Maedhros's brothers. The worst 2, in fact. If you've seen my series explaining Beren and Luthien, then you will know that while those 2 were trying to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth, the brothers Celegorm and Curufin were being straight-up villains. Like, they weren't morally complex or exhibiting shades of grey, they literally tried to murder both Beren and Luthien multiple times. But that's not even what's most relevant for this video. They also tried to usurp the secret elven realm of Nargothrond from their cousin Orodreth. And they tried to kidnap Luthien and force her to marry Celegorm, which very nearly led to a war between Nargothrond and a different elven kingdom, Doriath, which is ruled by Luthien's father, Eleuthingol, current owner of the liberated Silmaril. And so, due to the heinous actions of Celegorm and Curufin in the last part of the story, many folk of Beleriand have a general disdain for the Sons of Feanor, which is just so frustrating because Maedhros needs all the help he can get, and the whole point of his union is that all peoples will come together and unite against a common enemy. And yet, while he is trying to make this happen, his two idiot brothers Celegorm and Curufin vowed openly to slay Thingol and destroy his people if the Silmaril were not surrendered to them. Furthermore, their cousin Orodreth of Nargothrond would not march forth at the word of any son of Feanor because of the evil deeds of Celegorm and Curufin. And honestly, the people of Nargothrond and Doriath are well within their rights to hate Celegorm and Curufin, but because they do, the Union of Maedhros just isn't quite as strong as it could have been. From Nargothrond comes very little military aid, and from Doriath literally only 2 guys. Now, I will talk about them in just a moment, but luckily, despite how awful Celegorm and Curufin are, Maedhros is actually really great, and there are no small number of people in Beleriand who are more than willing to take up arms and fight alongside him. Most significant of them all is Maedhros' cousin, High King of the Noldor, Fingon. Now, despite the fact that their fathers absolutely hated each other, Maedhros and Fingon have one of the most loving relationships in the entire Silmarillion. It was Fingon who rescued Maedhros from Morgoth's imprisonment. It was on Fingon's behalf that Maedhros stood up to Feanor during the burning of the ships, and throughout their entire time in the story, these 2 guys have always been astoundingly close. You know, Maedhros loves Fingon like Legolas loves Gimli. And so, the Union of Maedhros basically emerges in the form of 2 great armies, both of which are made up of their own mini-alliances. On one side, there is the eastern host under the command of Maedhros, and on the other side is the western host who follow Fingon. Now, in the east, we basically get 3 main factions, each representing one of the 3 major races. First, we have the Elves of Himring, who have been fighting alongside Maedhros pretty much non-stop since the last battle, but we also have the warriors of Maedhros' wonderfully likeable brother, Maglor the Mighty Singer. And Maglor's people are primarily horse-riding elves, and they suffered major casualties in the last battle, but the survivors have spent the last decade or so living in Himring with Maedhros. So, although Maglor isn't quite as memorable, maybe, as Maedhros, don't forget about him. He is a significant part of this battle, and unlike most of the other Sons of Feanor, he actually is a really wonderful person. However, speaking of Feanor's sons, the last time we saw Celegorm and Curufin, they were also on their way to Himring to hide behind Maedhros' walls, and although we are told almost nothing of the specifics, we do know that they also fought in this battle. And so too did the other difficult son of Feanor's, whose name begins with a C, Caranthir the Dark. And honestly, Caranthir is a very important part of this battle, not so much because of what he does in it, but because of who he brings to it. And by that, I am referring to the men who fight in the eastern army of the Union of Maedhros, the Easterlings led by a chieftain called Ulfang. I talked about the coming of the Easterlings in the last video, but during the time that Maedhros was gathering his union, we are told that the Easterling chieftains summoned yet more of their kinsfolk out of the east, and they were marshalled and trained for war. Of these chieftains, Ulfang was the one who swore allegiance to Caranthir, along with his 3 sons, Ulador, remember that name, Ulfast and Ulwarth. However, there was another Easterling chieftain who fought in the Union of Maedhros, and his name was Bor. Along with his 3 sons, he swore allegiance to Maedhros himself, and he will go on to fight alongside Maedhros and Maglor once the Nirnaeth Arnoediad begins. But I can't possibly move on from the Eastern Army without first talking about something we see so little of in the Silmarillion, but when we do see it, it is so awesome. And that is an army of dwarves. So, in Beleriand, there are 2 major dwarven groups, and they live in one of 2 great dwarven strongholds within the Blue Mountains of the East, Belegost and Nogrod. Now, the Dwarves of Nogrod are very important players in future stories, but they're hardly mentioned in this battle except that their smithies provide great stores of weapons. However, the Dwarves of Belegost are an incredibly important part of Maedhros' army. And they are led by the only named dwarven king in the entire Silmarillion, Azaghal of Belegost. Now, in the Unfinished Tales, we are given a really cool little fun fact about Azaghal that isn't mentioned anywhere else in Tolkien's writings, but it really fleshes out his relationship with Maedhros. So, we're told that at some point prior to what's happening now, King Azaghal of Belegost was walking along the Dwarf Road, which runs through the east of Beleriand, and on that road he and his treasure were waylaid by orcs. Most likely he would have been killed by these orcs, but his life was saved by the timely coming of Maedhros. In repayment for this debt, Azaghal not only joins the Union of Maedhros a number of years later, but he also gifts to Maedhros his dwarf-forged helmet. And this helmet is very, very cool. It was swiftly regifted by Maedhros to Fingon, and then it was regifted again by Fingon to the mortal man Hador Lorindol, and he ruled the men of Dorlomin. And so this helmet became known as the Dragon Helm of Dorlomin, and it was an heirloom of the House of Hador. It was passed from father to son until it wound up in the possession of the current chieftain of the House of Hador, Húrinn. And it is this helmet that appears on the front cover of pretty much every single edition of the Children of Húrinn. So, although this helmet is often most associated with Húrinn's most relevant child, it was actually originally forged for the dwarven king Azaghal, and the only reason it was able to end up among the men of Dorlomin is because it was originally gifted by Azaghal to the elven lord Maedhros. Anyway, speaking of the House of Hador, let's now turn to the Western army of the Union of Maedhros and shift the focus of this video from Maedhros to his cousin High King Fingon. Now, although there are no dwarves in Fingon's host, there are a far greater variety of elves and men than in Maedhros's. The bulk of these elves are of course made up of the Noldorine warriors of Hithlum, the warriors who serve Fingon and presumably before him Fingolfin. And of course, alongside the Noldor of Hithlum fight the mannish warriors of Dorlomin, the House of Hador, who Tolkien describes as a great strength. And as you'll certainly know if you saw last week's video, the House of Hador are led by their young chief Húrinn Thalion, who spent a mysterious year of his youth in the hidden elven city of Gondolin alongside his younger brother Huor. Now, I've said this a few times already about different characters, but Húrinn and Huor really are two of the most important players in the story of the Nirnaeth Arnoediad and what comes after. But the House of Hador are not the only clan of men to join the great western army of Fingon, and whereas they stand at the king's right hand, at his left stands a group of woodland warriors from the forest of Brethiel. These axe-wielding men are known as the Haladin. They are of the House of Haleth, and they are led by Húrinn and Huor's uncle, a guy called Haldir. But it's not just woodsmen and people of Hithlum who make up Fingon's western army, he is also reinforced by warriors from really far away. Right down here, on the southwestern coast of Beleriand, are the lands known as the Falas, which are the home to a clan of shipbuilding maritime elves called the Falathrim. And the Falathrim are of course led by my joint favourite elf of them all, Círdan the Shipwright. Now, because Círdan is just the most awesome guy ever, he is actually the lord of two different havens, Eglarest in the south, where the river Nenning meets the sea, and Brythombar in the north, where the river Brython meets the sea. And just as he will do millennia later in the War of the Last Alliance, Círdan also sends warriors to fight in this first alliance, and they travel north with a company of fellow elves from Nargothrond. Now, I know I said a few moments ago that due to Celegorm and Curufin, Arnoediad of Nargothrond refused to join the Union of Maedhros, and that's true, but not every one of his people felt the same way. Thus far, typically, Nargothrond doesn't really take part in major battles. It was founded by my other favourite elf, Finrod Felagund, and the purpose of Nargothrond was that it would be safe and secret. It would be a haven for elves who want no part in the wars with Morgoth, and the whole point of Nargothrond is that it is hidden. It is defended by sneaky, stealthy elves instead of warriors upon a battlefield. However, there is an exception. During the last battle, Finrod Felagund's brothers, Arnegrod and Eagnor, were attacked and killed in their realm of Dorthonion. And so Finrod Felagund marched north with a small company of warriors from Nargothrond to try and save them. As it goes, he was too late, but they totally did end up fighting a really important battle at the Fen of Serech. And in that battle, the elves of Nargothrond only just managed to escape with their lives. And if you were really paying attention in the video where I talked about the battle at the Fen of Serech, or if you've read the book, you may remember how I very briefly mentioned two elven brothers of Nargothrond who fought in it, Gelmir and Gwyndor. Now, at the Fen of Serech, Gelmir was captured by orcs, and he was taken prisoner and carried back to Angband, where he was forced into slavery, working in the mines beneath Morgoth's fortress. And since then, we've not heard a single thing about him. Other than that he was captured, no one really knows what happened to him, and so when the Union of Maedhros is being formed, Gelmir's brother Gwyndor, who Tolkien describes as a very valiant prince, he sees an opportunity for vengeance, and so, against the will of his lord Arnoediad, without permission, he commands a small company, and he takes them north to fight in Fingon's host, where he hopes to either rescue Gelmir, or at least avenge him. Which brings us to the very last two individuals to talk about. They are the only two Sindar elves of Doriath who take part in this battle. As I've already mentioned, King Eleuthingol absolutely hates Celegorm and Curufin, which means by proxy he kinda hates Maedhros, which means, for reasons that aren't particularly logical, he also hates the Union of Maedhros. And so instead of sending Sindar soldiers to lend aid to this alliance, instead Thingol fortified the marches of his realm and went not to war. However, there are two elves of Doriath who were unwilling to have no part in these great deeds, and because they are both absolute legends, Thingol does give his leave for they alone to go and fight in the Nirnaeth, but only on the condition that they fight in Fingon's army and they do not serve any son of Feanor's. Now, these two Sindar dudes are among the most awesome elves in the entire Silmarillion, which I know is saying a lot, and although they are often overlooked, I guess I cannot hype them up enough. Their names are Mablung of the Heavy Hand and Beleg Cuthalion, Beleg Strongbow. Both these guys made a brief appearance towards the end of Beren and Luthien. They both took part in the hunting of the werewolf Carcharoth. Mablung was actually the one who cut the Silmaril from the beast's belly and placed it in Beren's hand, and Beleg is the captain of the March Wardens of Doriath. So whereas Mablung is kind of like the chief of the Sindar soldiers, Beleg is chief among their rangers. And both these guys are going to go on to be absolutely epic in the next story that I go through. But for now, there you go. That is every significant player in the Union of Maedhros. It actually takes 4 years for Maedhros to put this alliance together, but in the year 472 of the First Age, they are finally ready to fight. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad is ready to begin. So, what is the actual plan here? Well, Maedhros and Fingon take counsel together, and they come up with a strategy in which they will use the Eastern Army and the Western Army like a hammer on an anvil. Maedhros decided that he will march his host over the ashen desert of Anfauglith and advance upon the very gates of Angband. And as he does so, Morgoth's armies will hopefully be drawn forth to meet the army of Maedhros, and as they emerge from Angband looking to the east, Fingon should issue forth from the passes of Hithlum, and thus they thought to take the might of Morgoth as between anvil and hammer, and break it to pieces. Now, the signal that Fingon and the Western army were waiting for was the firing of a great beacon in Dorthonion. And this is interesting because Dorthonion doesn't really exist anymore. The highland forest that was once ruled by Arngrod and Aegonor, brothers of Galadriel and Finrod, was conquered and corrupted into Tower Nufuin, the forest under Nightshade, and by this point in the story it is an evil place. However, just before this battle properly begins, Maedhros and his warriors liberate Dorthonion in preparation, and the orcs were driven out of all the northward regions of Beleriand. And so we come finally to the appointed day, the moment that the Union of Maedhros was first summoned for. And there's a fascinating little contrast here between the outbreak of the Dagor Bragolak, the fourth battle, and the outbreak of the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. If you recall, when Morgoth began the fourth battle of Sudden Flame, he did so in a time of winter, when night was dark and without moon. However, this fifth battle comes on the morning of midsummer, when the trumpets of the Eldar greeted the rising of the sun. It is the complete opposite. In the west, the standards of Fingon are raised by his army, and in the east are raised the standards of the Sons of Feanor. Fingon awaits the signal of Maedhros from his fortress of Barad Aethel, and he looks towards the looming Thangorodrim. We are told there was a dark cloud about it, and a black smoke went up, and Fingon knew that the wrath of Morgoth was aroused, and that their challenge was accepted. And in this moment, a shadow of doubt falls upon Fingon's heart. Is Maedhros going to come? Is the plan going to work? Or are they all just staring death in the face by trying to challenge Morgoth? He turns eastward, and he uses his elven sight to search for any sign of dust rising from Anfauglith beneath the marching feet of Maedhros' alliance, but he sees nothing. Something has gone wrong in the east. However, at this moment, a wind comes up from the south, and the elves and men in Fingon's army lift their voices in wonder and joy. Fingon hears from afar the sound of great trumpets and the approach of an army 10,000 strong, unsummoned and unlooked for, with bright mail and long swords and spears like a forest. The shadow upon Fingon's heart passes, and as he recognizes the familiar sound of these trumpets, his heart is uplifted. But it isn't Maedhros who is riding to Fingon's aid, it's Turgon. Turgon! And this is so awesome because Turgon is of course Fingon's younger brother, but the last time they saw each other was 408 years ago. If you remember, pretty early on in the history of the Noldor in Beleriand, Turgon totally abandoned his coastal city of Vinyamar, and he disappeared into the mountains, with a company of elven followers who have not been seen since. From the perspective of the elves who didn't follow Turgon, the whereabouts and the well-being, the fate of him and his people is completely unknown. There may perhaps have come rumours of a hidden elven city somewhere beyond the knowledge of all save the eagles, but as far as anyone knew, Turgon and the elves who followed him simply vanished. Until now. At the very moment when it matters most, in the hour of Fingon's greatest need, the Liga of Gondolin is opened, and the hidden King Turgon reveals himself once more. He rides to the aid of his brother, and he brings 10,000 knights with him. And, very fun fact, one of these 10,000 elven warriors is Glorfindel, that absolute fan-favourite badass who will one day return from the dead and help Frodo Baggins escape from the Nazgul and make it to Rivendell. Also, he's the guy who comes up with the whole "not by the hand of a man shall the Witch King fall" prophecy. He'll be an integral part of the Gondolin storyline, but his first chronological appearance in the Silmarillion comes with the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, where he fights for the Noldor alongside his king, Turgon. Anyway, when Fingon realizes just how awesome this truly is, he shouts aloud, "Utulien aure, aya eldalie aratanatari, Utulien aure," which means the day has come. Behold, people of the Eldar and fathers of men, the day has come. And as Fingon's army hears his great voice echo in the hills, they cry out in answer, "Auta Ilome," the night is passing. This is unspeakably epic, and it's a great example of what is, I think, one of the central themes of the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and that is the dichotomy of hope and despair. And in this moment we see an incredible degree of hope. And it's a special kind of hope that Tolkien called Estelle. It isn't just, a general wishing, as in, "Oh, I hope it won't rain tomorrow." This is a profound type of hope. It is a hope that is based on something. It is founded in reality. Night will pass. Day will come. No matter what else happens, that will always be true. However, I'm afraid this is not an entirely happy story, and it seems that every time Tolkien gives us a reason to feel good about something, he then throws us a whole load of sinister trepidation, which brings us right back down again. And in this case, we are given some really nasty foreboding. You see, what neither Fingon, nor Maedhros, nor Turgon realise is that Morgoth is totally aware of what they're doing. He has spies in our hero's camp, and he knows all about this whole hammer and anvil plan. So, he sends out orcs. Nowhere near all of them, but a lot nonetheless. And instead of marching east to advance on Maedhros' army, as the good guys were planning for, instead Morgoth sends them west to assail Fingon's army, while they're still awaiting the signal back at Barad Eithel. And there's another cool detail here, because we are told that these orcs marched towards Hithlum clad in a dun raiment, and showed no naked steel, which basically means they wore dull clothing and didn't expose any metal that could catch the sunlight and give away their position. These are sneaky orcs in desert camouflage, and so they make it pretty far across Anfauglith before Fingon's forces at Barad Eithel are even aware of them. Now, as the orcs approach the Elven fortress, we see a really interesting reversal of stereotypes. We are told that the Noldor grew hot and impatient at the sight of the orcs, and their captains wished to assail their foes upon the plain. But it is the mortal chieftain Húrin Thalion who speaks against them, and he cautions a more measured and more well-reasoned response. Which is cool. We often think of men as being the impetuous ones, while elves are, typically more stoic and have a bit of a bigger picture perspective. But not in this case. Húrin demonstrates real wisdom here, and he warns the Noldor to beware of the guile of Morgoth, whose strength was always greater than it seemed, and his purpose other than he revealed. Basically, Húrin said to the elves, "We have a plan. Maedhros has not given the signal, so we must not do what Morgoth wants us to do." And so, the elves take his advice, and the western army remain behind their walls, and they let the orcs break themselves in assault upon the hills. However, we are told that the captain of Angband in the west has been given a single instruction by the Dark Lord. His entire purpose is to draw out the army of Fingon by any means necessary. And, by the way, this captain of Angband is a character that we know absolutely nothing about. We can really only speculate on whether he's an orc, or a Balrog, or some other corrupted Maya, or maybe something else entirely. We are given no clues. Anyway, this captain of Angband advances all the way to the outer walls of Barad Eithel, and then he sends out riders with tokens of parley. And among these tokens is a prisoner. Gelmir, remember him, brother of Gwyndor? Well, Gelmir is brought before the walls of Barad Eithel, and there the Noldor see that he has been blinded. For 17 years he has been enslaved within the pits of Angband, and now he is brought forth as a tool of psychological warfare. In front of the entire western army, the heralds of Angband hew off Gelmir's hands. Then they cut off his feet, and then they cut off his head. Gelmir's death is one of the most violent in the entire Legendarium. And obviously, regardless of how you look at this, it's horrendous. But I've often said on this channel that Tolkien's Legendarium is best viewed through an early medieval Anglo-Saxon lens. And from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, this isn't just evil, it's about the most disgraceful deed imaginable. The concept of honour was huge in Anglo-Saxon culture, and honour in warfare was a massive part of it. Yes, soldiers will, kill each other upon the battlefield, but for a herald to approach with tokens of parley and then brutally murder an unarmed prisoner as part of that parley, that is unconscionable. And it's a reminder that Morgoth isn't just a bad guy, he is the antithesis of every Anglo-Saxon value. Anyway, unfortunately, as I mentioned a few moments ago, within Fingon's alliance there is a small company of elves from Nargothrond, who are led by Prince Gwyndor. And Gwyndor is the brother of Gelmir, and the whole reason that he disobeyed his lord and rode to war in the first place was to find out what happened to his brother. And now he knows, and there is nothing he can do but avenge him. And so, Gwyndor's wrath was kindled to madness, and he leapt forth on horseback, and many riders with him, and they pursued the heralds, and slew them, and drove on deep into the main host. Which, on the one hand, is awesome. But from Fingon's perspective, this must be pretty annoying. Like, this isn't the plan. Maedhros hasn't given the signal, but what can he do? He could either stay behind the walls and let Gwyndor's riders be surrounded and killed, or he can ride out and join them in battle. At the sight of Gwyndor's charge, all the host of the Noldor was set on fire, and so Fingon put on his white helm, and he sounded his trumpets, and with his entire host behind him, he rode out from Barad Eithel in a sudden onslaught. And Tolkien uses the coolest language to describe this. He writes that the light of the drawing of the swords of the Noldor was like a fire in a field of reeds. And don't forget, these high elves would almost certainly wield blades that glowed blue in the presence of orcs, so their charge must have been one of the most awe-inspiring moments ever. And we're told that this alliance of elves and men did an incredible job at avenging Gelmir. Before the army that Morgoth had sent west could be strengthened, it was swept away, and we're actually told that in this moment, almost the designs of Morgoth went astray. The Noldor rode all the way across Anfauglith until they came to the very gates of his fortress, and in the forefront of that battle went Gwyndor and his elves of Nargothrond, who even now could not be restrained. In fact, we are told that Gwyndor, the badass, burst through the gate of Angband and slew the guards upon the very stairs of Morgoth's fortress. And the Dark Lord hears them. He hears them beat upon his doors, and because he is an absolute coward, he trembled upon his deep throne. So, this could be it. This could be the end of Morgoth. Is Gwyndor destined to avenge his brother by ending the reign of the Dark Lord? Will Angband be overthrown in this battle? Morgoth certainly thinks it's a possibility. But, as I just said, every time Tolkien gives us a reason to feel good in this chapter, he brings us right back down again. You see, although Gwyndor and his company are so epic that they are able to break into Angband through strength of arms and will, they are now trapped inside. And because they charged so far ahead, Fingon cannot help them. Tolkien tells us that every single one of those elves from Nargothrond was slain. Every one, except for Gwyndor. Just like his brother before him, Gwyndor is taken alive. He is imprisoned, he is enslaved, and he is tortured. The tale of Gwyndor is one of the greatest tragedies that Tolkien ever wrote. However, as hopeless as this moment may seem, we will see Gwyndor again. So remember his name, and remember who he used to be. Remember how astoundingly epic he was before he was taken by Morgoth. Anyway, while the riders of Nargothrond are being wiped out, Fingon is beginning to realise that he has indeed fallen into Morgoth's trap. Húrin was right. The Dark Lord sent that force of orcs with Gelmir and Dun Raymond to draw Fingon into battle prematurely, and it worked. So, now the Dark Lord unleashes a massive host of evil things that he's been holding back in wait until this moment. Through many secret doors in the mountains of Thangorodrim, orcs swarm onto the battlefield, and before long, Fingon and his warriors are beaten back from Angband with great loss, and they are forced to slowly retreat back west across Anfauglith. And I think there's something very telling here about how the Nirnaeth Arnoediad is perceived, both by Tolkien and by the elves who survived it. Because we are told that it's at this point, 4 days after the outbreak of the fighting, that the Nirnaeth Arnoediad began. Which means the first 4 days of this battle aren't considered part of the Nirnaeth. Unlike almost all previous battles, it's never referred to as the Dargor Nirnaeth Arnoediad, it is simply Nirnaeth Arnoediad. And this makes me think that those words aren't so much referring to a battle, they're referring to an event, to a turning point in history. Now, if you know what those Sindarin words, Nirnaeth Arnoediad, mean, then you know how this ends. If you don't, I will divulge that information at the end of this video, but, honestly, it's a bit of a spoiler. Anyway, as the host of Fingon retreats across Anfauglith, they suffer more and more casualties. Haldir, the lord of the Haladin, the uncle of Húrin and Huor, is slain in the rearguard, along with most of the men of Brethiel. Their bodies fall in the dust, and few ever return to their woodland homes. By nightfall on the 5th day, the host of Fingon are surrounded by Morgoth's armies, but they're still a long way from their walls of Barad Eithel. But, as I've said, this is a story about both despair and hope. And on the morning of the 6th day, hope returns to the Noldor. As the sun rises, Fingon's army once again hears the trumpets of those 10,000 knights from Gondolin. Until now, Turgon's host has been guarding the pass of Sirion to ensure that no orcs broke into central Beleriand, and he restrained most of his people from rash onslaught. But now, as he is needed most, Turgon hastens to the aid of his brother, and the Gondolin descend upon the enemy and break through their ranks while shining like a river of steel in the sun. Turgon hewed his way to the side of his brother, and upon the ashen sands of Anfauglith, Fingon and Turgon are finally reunited after over 400 years apart. And of course, this is not the only lovely little battlefield reunion, because by Fingon's side fight the brothers Húrin and Huor, the pair of mortal men who spent a year of their youth being raised in Gondolin by Turgon himself. And so, despite how awful everything may seem, for a moment our elvish brothers and our mannish brothers are glad, and hope was renewed in the hearts of the elves. But then things get even better. At the 3rd hour of morning, finally, the trumpets of Maedhros are heard in the east, and his banners assail the enemy in the rear. And this is of course what the alliance was built for. It didn't quite go as planned, but things seem to have worked themselves out. The only difference is that Fingon's army is now the anvil and Maedhros is the hammer, but they can still win. Before sunrise, the orcs were fighting one army that was weakened and surrounded, but now they have 3 to contend with, and 3 incredible elven lords that they're going to have to defeat in order to win. Finally, it is time for the orcs to despair, and we are told that in this moment, many do. The servants of Morgoth begin to waver, and some turn to flee. However, you may very well be wondering, what was it that happened in the east that delayed Maedhros for so long? Why didn't things go to plan? Why wasn't the beacon of Dorthonion lit? Well, the answer is that Maedhros has been betrayed. He doesn't know it yet, but the Dark Lord has one more card left to play. And I'll go into full detail on the battle in the east and the fates of the Sons of Feanor and the Dwarves of Azagal and the Easterlings under Bora and Ulfang in next week's video. But for now, I want to remain in the west. I want to stay with Fingon. Because it is at this time that Morgoth unleashes every single unit that he's been holding back. He loosed his last strength and Angband was emptied. We are told of wolves and wolf riders and orcs and trolls and balrogs and dragons that came forth into this battle, and at the head of them all were Morgoth's 2 mightiest captains, Glaurung, the father of all dragons, and Gothmog, the lord of all balrogs. We are told that elves and men withered before the strength and terror of Morgoth's final assault, and just as Maedhros and Fingon's hosts were set to unite as one, they are swept apart. Glaurung leads the dragons and many orcs and wolves and wolf riders into the east, where they will fight an epic battle that I'll talk about next week, but Gothmog leads the rest of the evil army against Fingon's host in the west. Fingon and Turgon were assailed by a tide of foes thrice greater than all the force that was left to them, and eventually their force was split in 2 as Gothmog drove a dark wedge between the elven hosts. Turgon's Gondolin were thrust south towards the fen of Serech, and so too were Húrin and Huor and their mannish warriors of Dolomin. And Tolkien doesn't explicitly say so, but I would assume that those 2 Sindar warriors of Doriath, Beleg and Mablung, were also part of this host that was pushed south, and potentially so were many of the Falathrim who'd been sent by Círdan the Shipwright. Which means Fingon doesn't have a huge amount of warriors left at his side by this point. The elves of Nargothrond are all dead. The woodsmen of Brethiel are slaughtered also, and the Noldor of Heathlum, who followed their king to war, are now surrounded. And it's not just orcs that they have to defend against. Speaking of, let's talk about Gothmog. This guy is the lord of all Balrogs. He is the High Captain of Angband, and honestly, the only other character who could be considered his equal is Sauron. But Sauron is very different from Gothmog. Sauron's power lies in sorcery and corruption and deceit, but he's not really much of a warrior. You know, Sauron is great at manipulating peace, but he loses a lot of battles. Gothmog, on the other hand, is the utter opposite. I don't think he's quite as intelligent or independent maybe as Sauron, but he is the ultimate battlefield badass. Prior to this battle, we've actually only seen him in action twice, but in his very first introduction, we see him kill Feanor, aka the main character, the mightiest elf ever to exist in body and mind and strength and subtlety, and yet in the same paragraph that we first meet Gothmog, he kills Feanor. Then, pretty immediately afterwards, he killed all of Maedhros' guards and brought the Elven Prince to Angband as a prisoner. So, point is, at this moment in the story, Gothmog is by far Morgoth's most competent captain. And after driving a wedge between the western host and the host of Gondolin, Gothmog turns upon Fingon. And thus begins another one of the Silmarillion's most epic duels, Gothmog versus Fingon. We are told that Fingon stood alone with his guard dead about him, but he kept on fighting. The High King of the Noldor stood against the Lord of all Balrogs, just as his father stood against the Dark Lord himself. And despite the astounding odds, Fingon held his own. Tolkien describes this duel as a grim meeting, but while Fingon's warriors died around him, he fought on against Gothmog, High King of the Noldor versus High Captain of Angband. And this battle should be remembered almost on par with Finigolfin versus Morgoth, you know? But in many ways, I think it's a lot sadder than that. As I've already said, Fingon stands alone, surrounded by the bodies of his people, warriors of the Noldor who presumably fought in and survived the previous battles. Many no doubt endured the hellish crossing of the Helcaraxes and even witnessed Morgoth's destruction of the two trees back in Valinor. But their road into rebellion from the Undying Lands has brought them here, to their deaths. And yet, even after his guards are all slain about him, Fingon fights on. Until another Balrog came behind him and cast a thong of fire about him. Then Gothmog lifted his black axe and he hewed Fingon in the head. White flame sprang from his helm as it was broken, and thus the High King of the Noldor was slain. His body was beaten into the dust by the Balrogs, and his blue and silver banner was trod into the mire of his blood. And this white flame that springs from Fingon's helm is very interesting, I think. I know flame is often associated with Balrogs, but that's not what this is. I think this white fire is Fingon's spirit, his Feia being suddenly forced from his body. His death, his separation of Feia from Hroa is so violent and so abrupt that his spirit ignites into flame as it departs Middle-earth and is summoned into death. It's so unfair. It's so dishonorable. Fingon had to be bound from behind for Gothmog to kill him. There's no glory in that. There's no distinction, it's just straight up cheating. And then, after basically holding his hands behind his back while Gothmog delivers the killing blow, the Balrogs have the sheer audacity to desecrate the High King's body, to trample his banner into the mire of his own blood. It's disgusting. And it's the end of Fingon, the most valiant prince of the Noldor. I want to read a passage from one of Tolkien's earlier writings that can be found in The Lost Road, and in it he describes Fingon's character in a really heartbreaking way. We are told that his valour was as a fire, and yet steadfast as the hills of stone. Wise he was, and skilled in voice and hand. Truth and justice he loved, and bore goodwill to all, both elves and men, hating Morgoth only. He sought not his own, neither power nor glory, and death was his reward. I think, to an extent, Fingon sort of represents a bit of a microcosm of the entire Noldorine people. He was there for all their biggest moments, and he is astoundingly heroic and well-intentioned, yet he is ultimately doomed by powers beyond his control. And I have to say, Fingon holds an incredibly special place in my heart. I very, very distinctly remember the first time I ever read the Silmarillion, and I really struggled, to be honest. The Silmarillion is not an easy book to read for the first time, but when I got to the part where Fingon goes off on his own to rescue Maedhros from Thangorodrim, the whole story kind of clicked for me. I finally got it. And when I first read about this valiant prince who journeyed alone into the realm of the Dark Lord to rescue a guy who at that point in the story he had every reason to believe was an enemy, I was absolutely hooked. That was the moment that the Silmarillion really latched itself into my brain. The bravery of Fingon, the heroism, the humility, the love that he displays for his cousin and his people. Honestly, it's part of the reason why this channel even exists. But now, that's all over. Fingon is dead, slain, and desecrated in the least honourable way imaginable. It's just so astoundingly sad. And I guess, now that we've got here, the cat is out of the bag. If a happy ending is what you're hoping for, I'm afraid you're watching the wrong video. What Nirnaeth Arnoediad means is unnumbered tears, for no song or tale can contain all its grief. And it didn't have to be this way. There were so many moments where the good guys could have won, but they didn't. It's an absolute disaster, and from the perspective of our heroes, the characters we spent so long rooting for, this is the beginning of the end. So, next week I will conclude this devastating trilogy by exploring the coming of the dragon Glaurung into the east, the resistance of the dwarves and the Easterlings and the Sons of Feanor, the final stand of the men and elves in the west, and the treason that cost our alliance everything. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. But until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Navaya Melanine.